Under the pale light of an early spring morning, Janelle Cross sat on the back steps of her modest house, sipping coffee and watching the mist roll over the sloping field that bordered her property. The quiet had always been her favorite part of living here, on the edge of two neighborhoods that couldn't decide whether they belonged together or not. One side, her side, was older. Single-story homes, fading fences, cracked driveways, and people who still waved from porches. Across the narrow road began the new development, rows of identical townhouses managed by a homeowner association that prided itself on order, symmetry, and silence. Between those worlds lay her strip of land, a half-acre of mixed soil, weeds, and a single detached garage that she and her husband Grayson rented out to a group of local kids to store their bikes and fix them up after school. It was harmless, a little chaotic maybe, but it gave the place life. That morning, Janelle thought about painting the garage doors a lighter color. She even said it out loud, the way she sometimes did when Grayson was still asleep, as if the thought would become real if spoken to the air. Then came the sound, the low metallic hum that didn't belong. At first, she thought it was thunder. When the ground began to tremble under her bare feet, she realized it was machinery. Heavy machinery. She stood, set down her mug, and stepped off the porch just as a yellow bulldozer rumbled into view from behind the fence. It was followed by another, and then a cement truck. Men in orange vests were shouting over the engines, waving their arms, guiding the machines toward her property line, as if they had done this 1,000 times before. "Hey!" she called, but the noise swallowed her voice. She jogged across the yard, her robe flapping against her legs, and stopped at the edge of the field where the first machine was already lowering its blade. "This is private property!" she shouted again. The driver barely looked at her. A foreman with a clipboard turned instead, squinting as if she were an inconvenience rather than the owner of the land. "You'll want to keep back, ma'am," he said, his tone brisk but polite, the kind of voice that had already made up its mind. "We're starting prep for the garage foundation today." "What garage?" Janelle demanded. He blinked, checked his clipboard, and pointed toward the far corner of the lot. "Parking structure. Phase 2 of the HOA redevelopment project. You should have gotten the notice." She stared at him, dumbfounded. "We're not part of the HOA." The man hesitated, flipping through his pages as if the words confused him. "It's on the list, Lot 79. "This is Lot 78, she snapped. "And even if it weren't, you can't just show up and start digging." By then, Grayson had come out, barefoot, shirt half-buttoned, eyes squinting against the glare. "What the hell is going on?" he asked, his voice rough from sleep. "They're saying we agreed to a parking garage," Janelle said, not taking her eyes off the machines. The bulldozer paused, engine growling, as though waiting for permission to continue. Grayson stepped forward. "No one agreed to anything. Get your trucks off my land." The foreman gave a rehearsed sigh and held out a laminated permit. "All authorized, sir. Signed, sealed, approved by the city and HOA board. Access point runs through your drive. You'll be compensated once construction begins." Grayson took the document, scanning it, his brow furrowing. The signatures looked official, even his own, except he had never seen the paper before. "Where did you get this?" he asked slowly. The man shrugged. "From the file. You can call the number if there's confusion, but we're on schedule, and I can't hold up the crew." Janelle felt a chill run through her as the first blade bit into the dirt. The sound of tearing earth filled the air, deep and final. "Stop!" she shouted, stepping forward, but one of the workers moved to block her path, not aggressively, but firmly enough to make it clear she wasn't allowed closer. Grayson pulled out his phone, his hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but disbelief. "I'm calling the police." The foreman raised an eyebrow but didn't object. "You do that. They'll confirm the permit's valid." He turned and waved to the driver. "Keep going." The machine roared to life again, and with each movement of the blade, The field that had belonged to them, that had held lazy afternoons and bicycle laughter, was being carved into something foreign. Janelle felt as if the world had shifted sideways, as if all her quiet mornings and simple routines had been rewritten without warning. When the police finally arrived, they didn't step onto the property. They stood by the road, spoke to the foreman, nodded, and left after a few minutes, their cruiser tires crunching over gravel. One of them gave her a sympathetic look before driving off. It was the kind of look reserved for people who were about to lose something they didn't know was already gone. Janelle didn't move until the machines shut down for lunch. Grayson stood beside her, silent, the permit still clutched in his hand. "They think they can just take it," he said finally, almost to himself. Janelle's voice was quiet, but steady. "Then we'll make them remember whose land it is." The wind picked up, carrying dust across the torn ground, erasing the boundaries that had once seemed so certain. The following morning began with the kind of silence that feels like a trick. Janelle woke before dawn, expecting to hear the usual hum of traffic from the highway beyond the trees, but the air was still, thick with the scent of wet soil. When she stepped outside, the machines were gone. The field was unrecognizable, half the grass stripped away, the once gentle slope gouged by the tracks of heavy tires. In the middle of the lot stood a wooden stake wrapped with bright orange tape and a small metal sign that hadn't been there the day before. She walked closer, barefoot, careful not to slip on the uneven ground. The letters were stamped cleanly. Future Site, Community Parking Complex, Phase 2. At the bottom was the logo of the HOA, the same one she had seen on the letterhead of the notice they'd received later that evening, folded neatly in their mailbox like a thank you card after a funeral. Grayson was already at the kitchen table when she came back inside, his laptop open, phone on speaker. He was talking to someone from the HOA's administration, his tone calm but clipped, the way he sounded at work when a client tried to change a deal halfway through a project. "I don't understand how you have authorization to use our property," he said. "We never signed any development agreement." The voice on the other end was soft, almost cheerful, repeating the same phrases over and over. "According to our records," and "you must have been notified," and "perhaps your spouse handled it." Janelle leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching her husband's expression change from disbelief to anger to something closer to dread. When he hung up, he stared at the phone for a long time before speaking. "They said we attended a public meeting 3 months ago. They have my signature on a community consent form." "That's impossible," Janelle said, moving closer. "You were in Denver that week. You have the receipts from the hotel." "I know," he replied quietly, "but they say my signature matches perfectly. Not forged, not copied. Real ink, real handwriting." He turned the laptop toward her, showing an attachment that had arrived in his email while he was on the call. The scanned document filled the screen. His name, his address, a scribbled line that looked exactly like his usual signature. It wasn't a bad imitation. It was perfect. "It's like someone watched me write it," he murmured. Janelle felt a tightening in her stomach, a slow panic rising behind her ribs. "We need to go to city planning. Today." By 9:30, they were standing in a sterile office filled with dusty blueprints and fluorescent lights. The clerk behind the counter, a woman with tired eyes and a badge that read Public Works Liaison, listened to their story without interrupting, then typed something into her computer. The soft clack of keys was the only sound for nearly a minute. When she finally looked up, her expression had shifted from polite neutrality to a kind of wary sympathy. "It says here your parcel was reclassified last fall as part of the municipal parking initiative," she said. "You were listed as voluntary participants in the development plan. That means the HOA acts as project liaison between the city and residents." "Participants?" Janelle repeated. "We didn't participate in anything. And how can the HOA be our liaison if we're not even members?" The clerk shrugged faintly, as though the question were larger than her pay grade. "Zoning jurisdiction can extend beyond membership boundaries if the parcel falls within the adjusted perimeter." That's not uncommon when neighborhoods expand. She hesitated, lowering her voice. But reclassification usually requires two independent approvals. One from the owner, one from a city representative. Both are on file. She turned the monitor slightly so they could see. Next to their address was Grayson's signature, and a second, unfamiliar one identified as municipal surveyor. Approved. The date matched the day after their tangle with the bulldozers. Janelle felt her pulse hammering at her throat. So they filed the approval retroactively, she said. The clerk didn't confirm or deny. She simply pressed her lips together, printed a copy of the record, and slid it across the counter. You can request an internal review, but it takes several weeks, she said. Meanwhile, construction will continue unless you file an injunction. That's the only way to stop them. Outside, the air was heavy with the metallic scent of rain. They sat in the car without speaking, the paper between them fluttering in the draft from the vent. Grayson finally exhaled, long and tired. They planned this. Every step. They can't just make signatures appear, Janelle said. He looked at her. They already did. Over the next few days, things grew stranger. A new mailbox appeared beside theirs, larger, brighter, with the HOA's logo embossed on the side. Flyers began to show up inside, addressed not to them, but to residents of Lot 79. Each one thanked them for joining the collective effort to enhance community value. Neighbors from across the road started waving more often, though their smiles looked rehearsed, hesitant, as if they'd been told to be friendly. A pair of teenagers, kids Janelle didn't recognize, rode past on scooters and pointed at the field, joking about the future garage. The sense of intrusion deepened with every hour. Even the air seemed different, filled with the faint smell of diesel and new asphalt, drifting from somewhere unseen. On the third evening, as the sun dropped behind the rooftops, there was a knock at the door. A tall man in a pale suit stood on the porch, holding a thin folder and a disposable coffee cup. He introduced himself as Elliot Ward, HOA Community Coordinator, and smiled the kind of smile that belonged in an advertisement rather than a human conversation. I just wanted to personally welcome you to the project, he said. We're thrilled to have proactive residents like you participating. Your parcel is essential to the layout, you know. We're not participating, Janelle said, standing squarely in the doorway. He tilted his head, as though humoring a child. Well, technically you already are. Paperwork's finalized, city's on board. But don't worry, the compensation package is generous. You'll even get reserved parking spots once the complex is done. Grayson came up behind her. You forged my signature, he said evenly. Ward's smile didn't waver. That's a serious accusation, sir. I suggest you be careful. Everything we've done is transparent and fully documented. If you have concerns, you can attend the next board session. He slipped the folder into Janelle's hands before she could refuse. Details are inside. I'll look forward to seeing you both there. Then he stepped off the porch, walked to his car, and drove away without a backward glance. Inside the folder were neatly printed renderings of the parking complex, financial statements, and something else. A photograph of their property taken from above, the exact borders traced in red, labeled HOA District Perimeter Adjustment, approved. At the bottom was a line of small text, lot reassignment authorized by Municipal Compliance Office, September 17th. Janelle's eyes caught on a faint watermark behind the words, an emblem shaped like a circle of leaves, the HOA's seal. But faintly visible beneath it, as though someone had tried to erase it, was another mark, older, stamped in faded blue, City Property Archive. Grayson, she said quietly, look at this. He leaned closer. They used a city form, he said, not an HOA one. So the city thinks it's theirs. He nodded slowly, the muscles in his jaw tightening. And the HOA thinks it's ours to give. That night, neither of them slept. The rain came back, tapping softly on the windows, and every sound seemed amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the distant hum of a generator somewhere in the dark, the rhythm of their own breathing caught between exhaustion and disbelief. For the first time since they'd moved here, Janelle felt like a guest in her own home, an intruder in a place that had once been safe. By morning, the ground outside would be covered with fresh tire marks again, and the wooden stake with its orange tape would stand a little closer to the house, as if the construction itself were creeping forward, inch by inch, indifferent to who lived above the soil it claimed. By the end of the week, the Crosses' home had begun to feel like the only island left untouched in a rising sea of dust and concrete. The hum of engines started each morning before dawn, and by the time the sun broke over the rooftops, the field behind their house looked less like land and more like an open wound. Janelle stopped trying to talk to the workers. They ignored her now, treating her presence as part of the landscape, something to step around. Grayson had taken to keeping a notebook, filling it with dates, times, license plate numbers, every small infraction he could observe. He said it made him feel like he was still in control of something, but his handwriting grew sloppier each day, the letters heavy with frustration. The air smelled perpetually of gasoline and fresh cement, and fine gray powder coated everything, even the leaves of the small magnolia tree Janelle had planted when they first moved in. One evening, as they stood watching the sun dip behind the half-built scaffolding, a white truck pulled up near their driveway. The logo of the construction company gleamed faintly on the door. A man in a hard hat leaned out the window, calling, "Evening. Just checking the perimeter access for tomorrow." His voice was casual, practiced, but his eyes flickered toward the house with something colder. When he drove off, Janelle noticed a scrap of paper fluttering from the fence post. It was a new notice, printed, laminated, and nailed in with precision. Access corridor established under municipal order. Unauthorized removal punishable by fine. She stared at it until her vision blurred, then turned to Grayson. "They're not even pretending anymore," she said. Later that night, when the machines had gone silent, she walked outside to clear her head. The air was heavy and electric, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. From the edge of the property, she could see faint lights twinkling beyond the construction zone, moving slowly in patterns, headlamps perhaps, or flashlights. The sound of muted voices drifted through the air, rhythmic, almost ritualistic. She called out once, and the lights froze. Then, one by one, they went dark, leaving only the faint echo of gravel shifting under unseen feet. Janelle stood there a long time, the back of her neck prickling, until a sudden gust of wind sent the loose dirt swirling around her ankles. The next morning, she found something strange on the ground near the garage, a single mud-caked glove. Not one of theirs. It was too large, too heavy, with a patch of orange reflective tape stitched to the wrist. When she showed it to Grayson, he frowned and turned it over. Inside the lining was a small metal tag etched with numbers, an employee ID. He looked it up on the construction company's website, but the code didn't exist in their database. "Fake," he muttered, "or someone who doesn't want to be found." That afternoon, they decided to visit the man who lived a few houses down, a quiet older resident named Richard, who had once helped them fix a burst pipe. His property bordered theirs on the far side, closer to the new development. But when they reached his house, the blinds were drawn, the porch light burned even in daylight, and a bright red sticker was plastered across the door. Vacant. Authorized demolition. Grayson knocked anyway. The hollow echo inside the house was his only answer. On the porch rail, someone had carved 3 words into the wood with something sharp. "Leave it alone." When they returned home, the air around the construction site seemed to vibrate with activity. The workers were no longer just digging. They were pouring the first layers of concrete. The foreman, the same one from before, stood near the edge of their property, clipboard in hand. Grayson approached him again, voice steady but strained. "You don't have permission to be here," he said. "This is private property. You're trespassing." The man didn't even look up. "Not my problem, sir. Talk to the board." "I did," Grayson snapped. "They lied." That made the man pause. He turned slowly, his expression unreadable, and for a moment the noise of the machines seemed to dim. "You think the board lies?" he asked, not in disbelief but in amusement. "That's cute." Then he turned back to his clipboard. "Step back, sir. You're in the safety zone." Grayson didn't move. "You don't have the right—" A voice cut him off from behind. "Mr. Cross." It was Elliot Ward again, immaculate in another pale suit, shoes untouched by mud, as though he'd stepped out of a different reality. He smiled with that same advertising-perfect calm. "You're obstructing a municipal project," he said gently. "Let's not escalate this. I'd hate for you to face a citation." Janelle felt something inside her snap. "You forged his signature, you stole our land, and now you threaten us with citations." Ward's smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened. "We didn't steal anything, Mrs. Cross. The community voted. Consensus was achieved. You're outnumbered, not oppressed." The phrase hung in the air like a slap. Outnumbered, not oppressed. Grayson took a slow step forward, and Ward instinctively shifted back. For a brief, charged moment, no one moved. Then the foreman blew his whistle, breaking the tension. "Back to work," he called. The machines growled to life, and Ward adjusted his tie. "I'll see you both at the next board meeting," he said lightly. "Maybe then we can speak like civilized people." That night, the Crosses argued for the first time in weeks. Not about the land, but about what to do next. Grayson wanted to fight publicly, to gather the neighbors, expose the lies. Janelle wanted to find another way, something quieter, but smarter. "They've already decided we're the problem," she said. "If we fight them on their terms, we'll lose." He looked at her, tired, the weight of sleepless nights etched into his face. "Then what do we do?" She didn't answer. 2 days later, as Janelle was watering the few plants that hadn't been choked by dust, she noticed something glinting under the magnolia tree. It was a small piece of metal, smooth and clean, with a faint engraving of the HOA's leaf emblem. When she picked it up, she realized it was part of a keychain. Attached to it by a single broken ring was a plastic fob stamped with a number, year 042. She didn't know what it opened, but she slipped it into her pocket, feeling its cool weight like a secret. That night, when she checked the backyard before locking up, she saw a new fence panel standing where the boundary used to be open. It was perfectly aligned with the rest, but it didn't belong to them. In the center of the wood, barely visible in the dim porch light, was a stenciled phrase in white paint: HOA access, authorized only. She called for Grayson, but he was already at the door, holding his phone, his expression pale. "Look at this," he said, showing her the screen. A message from an unknown number read, "Boundary adjustment confirmed. Please remove personal belongings from common use area by Monday." Janelle looked past him toward the window, where the reflection of their house blurred against the darkness outside. For a moment, it was impossible to tell where their home ended and the construction began. It all felt like one seamless structure now, an ever-expanding organism, swallowing everything in its path. She thought of the vacant house down the road, of the carved words on the porch rail, and of the silent lights that had blinked out in the night. The message on Grayson's phone was unsigned, but it didn't need a name. They both knew who had sent it. And as the wind carried the faint clang of distant machinery through the quiet neighborhood, Janelle realized that what they were facing wasn't just a bureaucratic mistake or a greedy development plan. It was something far more deliberate, a slow erasure of ownership, identity, and place, executed with the precision of a machine that didn't care who it crushed, only that it kept moving. The following week blurred into a kind of waking fever. Dust hung in the air like fog, clinging to the curtains, coating every glass of water, every plate left uncovered. Janelle stopped opening the windows. The smell of concrete and engine oil had seeped into everything, a dull reminder that their world had shifted without permission. The machines no longer startled her. They had become a rhythm, the pounding of steel and the grind of gears marking time in a world where no one else seemed to hear the noise. Grayson grew quieter, spending long hours in the small study at the back of the house, surrounded by maps, copies of permits, and his increasingly chaotic notes. He rarely spoke now except to mutter about inconsistencies, dates that didn't align, names that appeared on one document and vanished from another. His obsession with finding the thread that tied it all together became a kind of ritual, while Janelle wandered through the house like a ghost, trying to remember what their lives had felt like before all this began. It was a Wednesday when she decided to go to the community board meeting Elliot Ward had so smugly mentioned. Grayson refused to go, convinced it was a trap, but Janelle insisted someone needed to see it with their own eyes. "If we don't show up," she said, "we become the rumor. They'll say we agreed, or worse, that we don't care." The meeting was held in the sleek, glass-walled HOA office that overlooked the new development. The lobby smelled of disinfectant and new carpet. A receptionist offered her tea, smiled too broadly, and directed her to the conference hall. Inside, the room was arranged like a courtroom, rows of chairs facing a raised platform where 5 board members sat behind polished wood desks. Elliot Ward was among them, his pale suit immaculate as always, a silver pen poised over a notebook he didn't seem to use. The discussion was already underway when Janelle entered. A man in a checked blazer was presenting slides of projected profits and traffic flow improvements, his voice steady, rehearsed. "Community integration," he said repeatedly, as though the phrase itself could neutralize dissent. When Janelle raised her hand, the moderator barely glanced her way, but Ward leaned forward slightly, his smile flickering like a signal. "Ah, Mrs. Cross," he said smoothly. "So glad you could join us. I believe your property plays a key role in the upcoming development phase." His tone was warm, but the words carried the weight of ownership, as if the decision had already been made. Janelle took a seat near the front, her heart pounding. When the floor opened for comments, she stood. "You've built part of your foundation on private property," she said. "You used falsified documents, forged signatures, and manipulated city permits. That's not community integration. It's theft." Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't stop. The room fell into a brittle silence. Then Ward chuckled softly, tapping his pen against the desk. "Strong words," he said. "But I assure you, everything has been conducted transparently. If you believe there's been an error, you're welcome to file a grievance." "I already did," Janelle said, "and it was dismissed before anyone reviewed it." "That's unfortunate," Ward replied, tilting his head with feigned sympathy. "Perhaps you filled it out incorrectly. Bureaucracy can be so unforgiving." The crowd murmured, some shifting uncomfortably, others avoiding her gaze. She saw familiar faces, neighbors she'd waved to for years, staring blankly at the screen as if reading from a script. When the meeting adjourned, Ward approached her with his usual calm. "I admire your persistence," he said. "But you're exhausting yourself fighting something that doesn't exist anymore. Boundaries change. Ownership evolves. You'd do well to adapt." He gave her a thin smile and walked away before she could reply. Outside, the air felt colder than it should have. Janelle stood by her car, staring at the rows of identical houses glowing under the streetlights. Every window looked the same, every garden trimmed to regulation height, every mailbox perfectly aligned. The conformity was suffocating. For a moment she wondered if that was the real goal. Not just to build, but to erase individuality altogether. When she finally returned home, Grayson was still awake, hunched over his desk, the light from his laptop casting deep shadows on his face. He looked up when she entered, eyes rimmed with fatigue. "You were right," she said softly. "It's not a misunderstanding. It's deliberate." He nodded, then turned the screen toward her. "I found something," he said. On the display was a scanned blueprint. Not of the parking complex, but of a much larger plan, labeled Urban Cohesion Model, District 47. Their land, and much of the surrounding area, was shaded in red. This isn't just our property, Grayson continued. They're phasing out entire blocks. The HOA is acting as a front, but the real contracts are tied to a private infrastructure firm. They're calling it a redevelopment initiative, but it's essentially land absorption. Small parcels merged into municipal property, then leased back for profit. Janelle stared at the screen, trying to process it. How did you get this? He hesitated. It was in a shared folder linked to the city's public database, hidden under a generic file name. I don't think they expected anyone to dig that far. Before she could reply, a dull thud echoed from outside. They froze. Another sound followed, a metallic scrape against the garage door. Grayson grabbed a flashlight and moved toward the window. The beam caught movement. 2 figures near the fence, their outlines distorted by the fog. One of them seemed to be photographing the house. "Hey!" Grayson shouted, slamming open the door, but by the time he stepped outside, the figures were gone, the only trace of them a faint trail of footprints leading toward the construction site. When he returned, his hands were trembling. "They're watching us now," he said. "They know we know." The next morning, Janelle found the broken glove again, placed deliberately on their porch railing, the mud cleaned off, the orange tape gleaming in the sunlight. Beneath it lay a folded note, written in precise block letters. "Stay clear of the boundaries. You'll get hurt otherwise." No signature, no logo, just the unmistakable pressure of a threat made real. Grayson wanted to report it, but Janelle stopped him. "They'll say we're harassing them," she said. "That's how they win, by controlling the story." Instead, she suggested something different. "We find out who signed that municipal survey," she said. "The second name on the form. If we can prove that's false, the whole chain collapses." Grayson stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. "It's worth a try." They spent the rest of the day making calls, each department redirecting them to another, until finally a clerk in records hesitated before speaking. "That signature?" she said quietly over the phone. "It belongs to a contracted surveyor, external consultant, not city staff. Name's Paul Wexler. He's been on multiple HOA-linked projects." Janelle wrote it down, her pulse quickening. "Can we reach him?" The clerk hesitated. "He's not with the department anymore. His contract was terminated 2 weeks ago." "I'd be careful if you're looking for him. His name came up in an internal inquiry." That night, while Grayson searched online for any mention of Wexler, Janelle drove to the edge of the construction zone. The machines stood silent under the floodlights, the ground glistening with rain. She parked a little way off and watched. Near the half-built foundation, a temporary office trailer stood, its door half open, light spilling out onto the mud. She could see silhouettes moving inside, shifting papers, gesturing toward blueprints pinned on the wall. Then she saw him, Elliot Ward, leaning over a table, speaking animatedly to a man whose face she couldn't see clearly. The man was taller, wearing a construction vest, and when he turned slightly, she recognized the embroidered patch on his sleeve. Wexler Engineering. Her breath caught. So he was still here, working quietly behind the scenes. Ward handed him something, a folder, thick with documents, and the man tucked it under his arm before stepping outside. He lit a cigarette, looked around once, and began walking toward the perimeter fence. Janelle ducked down, heart hammering, as he passed within yards of her car. The glow of his cigarette flared briefly in the dark, illuminating the tired lines of his face. He looked older than she'd expected, worn down, haunted. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met through the windshield. She didn't know whether he saw her or not, but he hesitated, dropped the cigarette into the mud, and kept walking toward the shadows beyond the floodlights. When she returned home, Grayson was waiting by the door. "Where were you?" he demanded, his voice raw. She told him what she'd seen, every detail. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. "Then we have proof," he said finally. "If Wexler's still working, the permits are fraudulent. The city has to investigate." Janelle nodded, but she couldn't shake the image of the man's face, the exhaustion, the flicker of fear. Something told her he wasn't the villain they'd been fighting, just another cog in a machine too large to stop. The thought chilled her more than any direct threat, because if even the people building the walls didn't believe in what they were doing, then maybe there was nothing left to reason with. Only momentum, grinding forward, relentless, until everything familiar was buried beneath it. The following days unfolded with the unnerving calm of a storm that had yet to break. Everything looked the same on the surface. The construction site hummed, the trucks came and went, and the neighbors waved politely as if rehearsing civility. But beneath that thin veneer, something darker had settled. Janelle began waking in the middle of the night to the faint hum of machinery, even though the work supposedly stopped at sundown. The light from the flood lamps bled through their bedroom curtains, an artificial dawn that made sleep feel impossible. Grayson grew more paranoid with each passing day. He had installed motion sensors, cameras, even a second lock on the gate, but every morning he found small signs of intrusion, footprints in the mud, new markings on the fence, and once, a fresh coat of paint covering the spot where the warning note had been left. Whoever was behind it wanted them to know they were being watched, but never gave them anything tangible to fight. Janelle spent her mornings driving through the older parts of town, visiting city offices and records departments, trying to trace any official document that mentioned Paul Wexler. Most clerks acted as if they'd never heard the name, while others spoke in guarded tones, eyes flicking to the walls as if afraid of being overheard. In one narrow office on the 4th floor of the Development Services Building, she finally found a trace. A transfer form dated 2 years earlier, authorizing Wexler Engineering to survey a section of the very same district they now lived in. The document bore 2 stamps, one from the HOA and another from the Office of Urban Partnerships. But there was a third mark, faintly visible when she tilted the page under the light. Contract terminated due to compliance breach. When she asked the clerk about it, the woman gave a strained smile and said, "That file shouldn't have been visible. I need to take it back." Janelle stepped aside and let her, pretending to leave, then returned moments later to snap a quick photo before the file disappeared into a locked cabinet. It was the only proof they had that someone inside the city knew what was happening and had chosen to bury it. That evening, she showed the picture to Grayson. He stared at it for a long time, rubbing his temples. "This isn't enough," he said. "They'll call it a clerical error." "It's a start," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "It means we're not crazy." But their small victory did not go unnoticed. The next morning, 2 uniformed officers arrived at their door. The visit was polite but tense. One of them, a tall woman with unreadable eyes, explained that there had been complaints about the crosses, interfering with authorized municipal work. According to her report, a construction worker claimed they had trespassed on the site after hours and tampered with safety equipment. Grayson protested, showing the footage from their security cameras, but the officer only nodded, taking notes without comment. Before leaving, she handed them a citation, an official warning. "You'll want to stay clear of the work zone," she said. "Further violations will escalate to legal action." When the door closed, Janelle sank into a chair, her hands trembling. "They're building a case against us," she whispered. By the following week, they began to feel the weight of isolation. Friends stopped answering calls, neighbors avoided them entirely, and even the small grocery store clerk who used to chat with Janelle now kept his eyes down, scanning her purchases in silence. Flyers appeared around the neighborhood, warning residents against obstructionists, jeopardizing the redevelopment project. One morning, someone dumped a pile of gravel across their driveway. Grayson spent 2 hours shoveling it away, while Janelle watched from the window, the sound of his labored breathing cutting through the still air. "They want us exhausted," she said to herself. They want us to give up. It was that evening, when the sun was low and the machines had gone silent, that Janelle saw something new. A black SUV parked halfway down the street, engine idling, headlights off. It didn't belong to anyone on their block. She watched it for nearly an hour, until twilight gave way to darkness, and only when she turned off the porch light did it finally pull away. The next morning, there was another envelope in their mailbox. It bore no return address, only a stamped logo, a stylized oak leaf, the HOA's emblem. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one line typed across the center. Final notice. Evacuation recommended prior to demolition stage. No date, no signature, no explanation. Just a quiet statement of intent. Grayson was furious. They can't do this without court approval, he said, pacing the kitchen. There's a process. They have to serve us officially. But Janelle's voice was distant when she answered. You still think they need a court? She walked to the window, watching the construction site where the skeleton of the garage now loomed like a monument to arrogance. They already act like they own everything. That night, a storm rolled in. Rain battered the roof, wind howled through the cracks in the siding, and the sound of thunder masked another deeper noise, the rhythmic thumping of machinery still working under the cover of darkness. Janelle stood by the back door, staring into the sheets of rain, when a flash of lightning illuminated the construction zone. For a split second, she saw movement near their fence, a figure in a reflective vest, crouching by the boundary markers. The flash faded, and he was gone. She rushed outside, ignoring Grayson's shout, mud splashing around her ankles. When she reached the fence, there was no one there, but a small plastic device had been lodged into the ground. A sensor, blinking red, its base stamped with the same oak leaf emblem. The next morning, the sensor was gone. In its place stood a metal post with a laminated sign, Restricted Area, Active Work Zone. Grayson filed another complaint with the city, attaching photographs, maps, and their video footage, but days passed with no response. Instead, a letter arrived from a law firm representing the HOA, accusing them of defamation and interference. They're tightening the noose, Grayson said bitterly, dropping the letter on the table. If we push harder, they'll bury us in lawsuits. Janelle said nothing. She was staring at the keychain she had found weeks ago, the one marked with the number 0042. Something about it had nagged at her ever since. That night, while Grayson tried to rest, she sat at the kitchen table, turning it over in her hands. On a whim, she compared the number to the documents he had saved. It matched a code listed on the corner of the development blueprints, the designation for one of the underground access points beneath the garage site. She realized then that the construction wasn't just above ground. They were building downward into the old utility tunnels that crisscrossed beneath the neighborhood. It explained the hum they heard at night, the faint vibration underfoot. They weren't constructing a simple parking structure. They were reinforcing something older, something buried. When she told Grayson, he went pale. If they're using the old tunnels, that's federal property, he said. It's illegal to repurpose that infrastructure without clearance. If we can prove that, we can stop them. But by then, it was already too late. 2 nights later, the power went out across their block. The street lamps died, the machines went silent, and for the first time in months, there was real darkness. Then came the sound of footsteps outside, measured, deliberate, the crunch of boots on gravel. Janelle grabbed a flashlight and peered through the blinds. A figure stood by the fence, motionless, face obscured by the rain. When the light hit him, he didn't flinch or turn away. He simply raised one gloved hand and pointed toward the ground where the boundary line ran. Then, just as quickly, he was gone. The next morning, the fence was gone too. In its place, a flat expanse of wet earth stretched seamlessly into the construction site, as if the boundary had never existed. The machines were back, moving deeper into the soil, and the sound of drilling filled the air again. Janelle stood at the window, her reflection merging with the gray landscape outside, and realized that they were no longer defending a piece of land. They were defending the very idea that they still existed on it. The storm that had drowned the neighborhood finally broke into a long stretch of colorless mornings, but nothing returned to normal. The machines had gone silent again, replaced by the low mechanical hum coming from somewhere underground. The ground itself seemed to tremble, a faint vibration that never quite stopped, like a hidden pulse running through the soil. Janelle and Grayson barely spoke now. The exhaustion had hollowed them out, leaving behind two people who measured their days by what hadn't been taken yet. The garage, though half surrounded by churned mud, still stood. It had become a relic, the last visible mark of what was once theirs. Each morning, Janelle stepped outside to see whether it was still there, and every time it was, she felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief, as if the universe had forgotten to erase it. 3 days after the power outage, a city vehicle arrived. 2 officials stepped out, their badges real, their expressions rehearsed. They informed the Crosses that an inspection was scheduled for safety verification, something about structural hazards from nearby excavation. They spoke gently, using the tone reserved for people whose fates had already been decided elsewhere. Janelle asked for paperwork. One of the men hesitated before handing over a single sheet stamped with the municipal seal. At the bottom was a signature she recognized immediately: Paul Wexler. Her throat went dry. "He's still authorized to sign these?" she asked. The man gave a small, uneasy shrug. "He's a consultant on contract. That's all we know." When they left, Grayson stared at the document for a long time, then said quietly, "If he's signing inspections, they're close to finishing. That means the final approval is next." That night, they went back to the site. It was close to midnight, fog rolling low across the street, muting the world into shades of gray. They carried flashlights and moved carefully, following the ruts where heavy vehicles had passed. Near the foundation, the mud was slick and black, glistening like oil. The air smelled metallic, almost electric. A generator thrummed softly somewhere out of sight. They stopped when they reached a rectangular steel hatch embedded in the ground, new, bolted, freshly welded. The number stenciled across it read 0042. Janelle's heart pounded as she knelt, running her fingers over the metal. The same number from the keychain. "They built over the tunnels," she whispered. "It's all connected through here." Grayson was already unhooking the key fob from his pocket. It slid perfectly into a small, recessed slot near the hinge. When he turned it, the lock released with a mechanical hiss. The hatch opened a fraction before sticking, as if something resisted from below. A thin gust of stale air rose up, smelling of rust and water and time. Janelle aimed the flashlight downward. A narrow stairwell disappeared into darkness, lined with corroded pipes. "We shouldn't," Grayson said, but she was already descending, one hand trailing along the cold wall. The sound of dripping echoed faintly. When she reached the bottom, her beam swept across a wide corridor, half flooded with shallow water. Concrete pillars stretched into the distance, and there, rising out of the murk, were dozens of metal cylinders, sealed storage tanks, each marked with old government insignias so faded they were barely legible. Janelle waded closer, brushing grime from one of the labels. Beneath the dirt, she could just make out the words, "Communications Reserve, Federal Property." It hit her then. The parking complex wasn't just a land grab. They were burying a piece of forgotten infrastructure, one that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. The HOA project wasn't about community or profit. It was about concealment. Footsteps echoed from above. Grayson hissed her name, motioning frantically. Someone else was on the site. They ducked behind a pillar as 2 flashlights cut through the dark. Voices followed, Ward's smooth tone, unmistakable even underground, and another deeper one that could only belong to Wexler. "It's stable now," Wexler was saying. "The reinforcement should hold once the top slab sets." Ward's reply was almost casual. "Good. No delays. The crosses are done interfering. They'll be out by week's end. Grayson clenched his fists, ready to step out, but Janelle caught his arm. Wexler's voice changed, lower, almost pleading. You told me this was a temporary structure. I didn't sign up for this. Ward's response was a quiet, dangerous laugh. You signed everything I put in front of you, Paul. You don't get to have a conscience now. A pause, the sound of boots in shallow water. If it helps, they'll be compensated. Eventually. Something inside Janelle broke then. Not with anger, but with clarity. The system wasn't corrupt in parts. It was corrupt in design. Every signature, every approval, every smiling face was just another cog, turning toward the inevitable. She stepped forward before Grayson could stop her, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the dark. You're burying federal property under a fake community project, she said, and you're using our land to do it. Ward turned, his expression more annoyed than surprised. Mrs. Cross, he said evenly, you shouldn't be here. Grayson joined her, his voice shaking but firm. You forged our names. You lied to the city. You're breaking federal law. Ward sighed as though bored. You think anyone will believe you? You're trespassing in an active site. You've violated multiple ordinances. By morning, this will all be sealed. You'll have nothing but your word, and your word means nothing. He turned to Wexler. Finish it. But Wexler didn't move. He stared at the crosses, his face pale, eyes hollow. They're right, he said quietly. We crossed a line. Ward's jaw tightened. Paul, he said, walk away. Instead, Wexler pulled a small device from his pocket, something like a control remote, and tossed it into the water at Janelle's feet. This deactivates the lock on the upper hatch, he said. Get out while you can. Then he turned toward Ward. The moment stretched, fragile, electric. You don't understand what's down here, do you? Ward's voice was sharp now. I understand enough to make sure it stays buried. Janelle grabbed Grayson's arm. We have to go, she said. But before they could move, the generator above them sputtered, the lights flickered, and a deep, grinding sound rolled through the tunnel as the first layer of concrete began to pour. Wexler shouted something, lost under the thunder of falling debris, and Ward disappeared into the shadows. Janelle and Grayson ran, splashing through the rising water, slipping, gasping, as the stairwell loomed ahead. Behind them, the ceiling groaned. She could smell the wet cement as it hit the floor, sealing the space like a tomb. They scrambled up the steps just as the hatch slammed shut behind them, the lock snapping into place. For a long moment they lay on the cold ground, coughing, their lungs burning. When they finally looked up, dawn was breaking. The trucks were gone, the site eerily still. Only the faint outline of wet concrete remained where the hatch had been. Janelle sat up slowly, the reality sinking in. Whatever had been buried beneath their land was now gone, sealed, silenced, erased. But they were alive, and they had seen enough to know that the truth could not be hidden forever. The world above would keep building, but the earth below would remember. Morning came gray and windless, the kind of dawn that made the world look stripped of color, as though it were trying to forget what had happened. The construction site was empty now, fenced off with new warning signs that claimed the area was under municipal review. Janelle stood by the window, a blanket around her shoulders, watching men in city vests walk the perimeter and take photos. None of them looked toward the house. They didn't have to. Their presence said everything. That control had shifted again, that what was once hers now belonged to someone else's jurisdiction. Grayson sat at the kitchen table, staring at his hands, the faint scratches and cement burns still visible. He hadn't spoken much since that night in the tunnel, but his silence no longer felt like defeat. It felt like the breath a person takes just before deciding what to do next. 2 days later, a letter arrived from the City Department of Infrastructure. It was written in the careful language of bureaucracy, acknowledging irregularities in the permit process and promising a full audit of all contracts tied to the HOA's development projects. There was no mention of Wexler or Ward or the buried hatch. Only a single line near the end hinted at the truth. Further excavation has been deemed unsafe, and all expansion rights suspended indefinitely. Janelle read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it beside the sink. "They're not admitting it," she said quietly. Grayson nodded. "They never will." But they stopped. It wasn't victory, not in the way either of them had imagined. The land was ruined, the garden gone, the garage surrounded by hardened concrete that would never be moved. And yet the silence that followed felt strangely clean, like air after a fire. Weeks passed. The city removed the remaining equipment. The HOA offices went dark, and one morning a new notice appeared on the board by the entrance to the development. It announced a restructuring of the association, pending investigation, and invited residents to apply for interim oversight roles. Janelle laughed when she saw it, not out of amusement but disbelief. Grayson asked what she would do. She looked out at the cracked soil where their boundary used to be and said, "If they want oversight, they'll get it. But this time it's going to mean something." She filled out the form that same afternoon. By the end of summer, grass began to return along the edges of the property, thin and uneven, but persistent. The hum of machinery had faded into distant memory, replaced by the quiet rhythm of wind and insects. Sometimes at night, when the air was still, Janelle thought she could feel a faint vibration beneath her feet, a buried heartbeat that never stopped completely. It no longer frightened her. It reminded her that what is hidden never stays buried forever, not when someone is still willing to remember. And as the first autumn leaves fell across the field, she finally understood that survival itself was a kind of ownership, one they could never take away again.